right. Welcome, everyone, to the Fireside Chat with Josh Cutler. We are so excited to have you here. I am very lucky to get to introduce Josh Cutler. He is the Chief Data Scientist at UnitedHealthcare, also sometimes known as UHC, where he is responsible for defining, transforming, evangelizing the impact that all of the roles that you all in the audience have at UHC. So things like engineers, data scientists, product, et cetera. At UnitedHealthcare, he's been involved in machine learning infrastructure, NLP and LU issues, all of this. And we're super lucky to have him here at L3-AI. This is our Fireside Chat. We don't have Fire, but we do have Josh, and he is amazing. So better than Fire itself. So I have a handful of questions for Josh, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you because I know you all have great questions for him. Josh, anything I missed in your intro?
No, that was a fantastic intro. I need to somehow get you to introduce me more often. That was
great.
Awesome.
Yes, I'm available to join you at parties and just walk in. So my first question is UHC, United Health Group, Optum. It's a really, really big company. Are there special considerations you make when you deploy chatbots at such a large brand?
Absolutely. So when we think about how we deploy chatbots, right, we interact with so many different constituencies, and we do it across so many different parts of our digital properties. That one of the things that you can get away with at a smaller company is say, we're going to start with this little use case, and then grow that into like a more encompassing chatbot. And I did that in previous roles, but for us, we have so many little use cases that can start as those POCs. At a certain point, we have to think of our strategy, like what is the way that a member can interact with our chatbots, right? Do we have 20 of them? Do we have 5 of them? Is it the same infrastructure tooling for doctors that interact with us as for patients? Because doctors might interact with us to try and figure out, whether or not something is covered in a benefits plan. They may also be interacting with part of our infrastructure around just understanding kind of clinical care, right? So we have so many different potential places we could deploy them. Figuring out the scope, right, and how we kind of present these in a sensible way is a challenge that I haven't faced anywhere else.
Awesome. And if I see questions during, I may kind of, if they have to do with what we're talking about, I may invite them to ask kind of within the Fireside Chat. But right now, everyone's letting me go to my next question. So kind of rolling right into this, healthcare is a big domain. You kind of just commented on doctors versus patient questions. How do you make these chatbots at UHC contextual and helpful?
Yeah, so that's a great question. When I think about the scenarios in which you want to use things like chatbots, right? You have the really simple, just like effectively FAQ, right? It's a dramatic reading of what you could put on your webpage. They're going to answer questions for you. Those are relatively straightforward, and those actually work well, right? So the question, where can I find my flu shot? That doesn't necessarily have to be contextual beyond the, we know what city you're in, those sorts of things. So I think those types of things we're able to deploy with relative ease. Now, when we think about a question like, is this going to be covered under my benefits plan? Now, that all of a sudden becomes a very, very contextual question because it really depends on you and the procedure you're talking about, and maybe any work that you've done prior to that, right? So in that case, it really comes down to connecting our data, right? We do have this information. We can answer this question for you if you call us on the phone. So it's about making sure that we're building out our chatbots in such a way that they're leveraging this connected data that we have about our members, about our providers. One of the things that you run into when you're taking an interaction that can typically happen with a person and trying to make it happen via a chatbot is your backend infrastructure may not serve up this information in a way that's amenable to consumption by chatbots. So if you think about something like a benefits plan that says this is covered under these conditions, well, it's trivially easy for a call center agent to read that benefits plan like, oh yeah, I can logic over this. It becomes a wholly different problem if we want our chatbots to be able to reason over that. So a lot of the work that goes into creating experiences that are better for our members is about structuring data that we have internally that might not be amenable to kind of reasoning over by a chatbot, but is super easy for humans to reason over, and we've had humans doing that, up until recently.
So how do you decide what skills or abilities are going to be built into a UHC?
So I think in general, there's three criteria that I like to think about. Right? So there is this even viable? And this is something we bump into a lot. I think a lot of the kind of making the chatbot work part, we're pretty good at making that. I think a lot of folks are good at that. There's a lot of people at this conference, right, who build technologies for that. But the types of questions that you need answers to are not always viable. So if you were going to say, I want to build a chatbot to tell me what the stock price is going to be in a week, like you can build a chatbot, but it's not going to be correct because you're fundamentally doing something that's not viable, at least if it is. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. The next thing is there value in doing it? So there are a bunch of scenarios that if we could make them available via chatbot, that doesn't necessarily make our members happier. It doesn't necessarily make our doctors happier just because they're happy with how things are, right? So, and then the third one for us is just volume, right? Like, there are some things that we know we could do and it might make people happier, but if it only happens 10 times and we get hundreds of millions of phone calls, that's probably not where we're going to start, right? So you look for the intersection of those three things and you can settle in pretty quickly on the types of experiences that make sense for us to pursue. I think concurrent to that, there's also, is this something that people want to consume via chatbot, right? And that's not just a healthcare question. I think that's anybody who's building in this space has to think about whether or not the scenarios that they're building out are things that people are ready to consume virtually, are ready to consume via a chatbot type scenario. I think there's been a huge shift because of COVID and just people's appetite for consuming technology generally. We have huge populations of people, right, that are Zooming that never did a year ago. And I think that people are more amenable to these. But there are certain conversations that you might have with your doctor that you absolutely do not want to have with a chatbot. And so figuring out what is their actually appetite for that people would be okay with, I think is a big consideration as well.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting. So my next question is about improving these assistants. So that was about choosing skills. How do you work on improving and versioning your chatbots, updates? How does that process look like, again, at a super large company with a lot of different contexts?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the details are slightly different depending on whether we've deployed something within our call center, we've deployed something on the website. But fundamentally, I think we invest a lot in telemetry to make sure that what we're doing is effective. No successful chatbot deployment is a fire and forget type operation, at least not yet. So we spend a lot of time measuring, I guess, the unhappy path. So obviously, you design your chatbots with a certain conversational design, with certain experience in mind, and you hope that that's why people show up. But you're going to get off the happy path. And being able to, kind of route people to a way to still get an answer is important. But B, measure that you did that is a big part of improving. From a data perspective, like my experience at United is very different than it was when I was doing startups in the space. When you're doing a startup, like you don't necessarily have the data, but we have hundreds of millions of interactions with our members. So we do have good insight as to what types of questions they ask. Now, no plan kind of can account for reality once you get these things out there, but measuring and then planning for that iterative cycle is a big part of it for us.
So even more specifically, Liz kind of asks exactly about this. How has your experience evolved over time based on what you've learned working in the startup space with chatbots and in the insurance space where it's really...
Yeah, so I think what I've learned is that I found that I can get a lot more traction out of setting user expectations than just trying to solve all of the problems within the chatbot itself. So a lot of dissatisfaction with an experience is about not setting the right expectation for what a consumer can even do with the chatbot. And so investing up front was saying, like, these are the types of experiences we expect you to have, not routing people to that chatbot if they weren't even trying to do those experiences, has saved a lot of headaches. And I guess this kind of sounds obvious in retrospect, but that is not necessarily how chatbots have always been deployed, just at places I've been. So I think really figuring out how to set those expectations has been the main thing. I think a lot of the technology around just the core, can we, figure out what intent this person is mapping to? Can we use fulfillment search? Like those sorts of things. I think we've got really good practices around. I do think it's the user experience and kind of the product design of these things that I've seen the most evolution on.
So what do you consider a successful virtual assistant at
So success criteria for us is that our members, providers, whomever are happier, right? So I know it's super nebulous, but that actually kind of is the point, right? It's to get you off the phone, right? If you want a new insurance card and you have to call in and wait for 15 minutes, that sucks, right? But if you can do it via chatbot in 10 seconds, that's great. And so that is a way better experience, and that's what success looks like. It's not always about kind of making those types of experiences faster. Sometimes just getting you better answers is also a good thing. So we've invested in building chatbots that help our call center agents, right? So we're not necessarily routing a member who is calling in to a chatbot, but we're making our call center agents get better answers faster because they have access to tools internally that can surface information for them that they then present out. And that's also really successful. And we've found that people are way happier with the results they get.
So I don't know if any of the audience members were in my panel a couple hours ago, but I asked the people on that panel 2 questions. I'm going to ask you the same ones.
Okay.
First, what would your dream skill be for one of the UHC customer-facing assistants, or even internal UHC assistants? What's like a dream you see for those?
A dream I see for customer-facing one. So right now we have a lot of information on our digital properties. And so I think that to the extent that we can get people the information they need rather and push it to them versus say, oh, right, actually, when you want to understand, where you're going to get your COVID vaccination, go to this other site, scroll down, read it in the FAQ there. That to me, I think is the biggest opportunities for us from our member facing opportunities. We are thinking about a whole slew of other things, right? You can imagine symptom triage, these types of things. It's not obvious yet that folks necessarily want that. And that comes into the, what experience do I want to have with a chatbot? And what are people ready to consume?
So there's a second question to this, and I'm actually going to save it for then because Tiffany from CareDash asked a really important question that I think Josh is uniquely suited to answer, which is how do you handle personal health information and HIPAA compliance, all that kind of stuff that patients are putting into it?
So, as a healthcare company, this all data we use everywhere, right, is PHI, and we are incredibly serious about that. So, as far as I'm high trust, HIPAA compliance, those things are kind of table stakes for doing any work when you work in the healthcare space. So, any partner that we would work with, we would expect to be high trust and follow all the best practices. We have to do that across the board. So from a technical perspective, that's just about following best practices and respecting your users. When I think about protecting privacy for members, I also think about the experiences, right? So chatbots on my phone are very different than maybe an experience you have with a smart speaker. So I think it's important to be thoughtful. And I joke about it, but if I were to get a notification from a chatbot that says, hey, Josh, your hemorrhoid cream is ready, it's very different when it's via SMS than when it's on my smart speaker. Alternatively, you can imagine those types of experiences within a clinic itself, right? And so all of those have different who's listening, and then just being respectful and understanding kind of the potential audience, especially when you get out of the text space, I think is a really important part of that design.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. What can be overheard by other people on voice-based assistants? I was muted, but the hemorrhoid one got me. There are a lot of things that I wouldn't want, broadcast in my home about my personal health information. So super interesting. So I'm going to ask this kind of non-related question that I asked everyone on the panel because it's fun. But everyone in the audience, if you have more questions, we have more time. But my favorite question to ask is if you could have a dream virtual assistant in your own life.
Oh, that's a really good question. So my dream virtual assistant, and there's actually, I have friends who are working on this problem, so maybe that's why it's seated in my head. is the one that helps me achieve my goals, right? It's that life coach, the thing that reminds me like, hey, you haven't called your mom in 2 weeks. Like, what's wrong with you? That's a priority for you, or at least you say it is. Why don't you prove it? So I think that, yeah, the one that reminds me to get off Twitter, the one that just kind of checks in with me and says, hey, Josh, are you kind of living what you say your values are? I'd love that. I like that. That's the chatbot experience I'd love to have. For those of you entrepreneurial folks out there, I'd totally pay for that one. So
that's awesome. Audience members, any other questions for Josh? So far, this has been awesome. UnitedHealthcare is doing super interesting. Oh, Pascal's building it. They just said it in the chat. Oh, that's a great question. So what's the importance of federated learning with healthcare virtual chatbots?
So interesting question. Our chatbots are generally centralized, right? And our membership is generally centralized. So we don't necessarily have to kind of anonymize data at the edges to do learning. I think there are environments where you'd want to do that, though typically those are not things we've bounced into yet. I can imagine in a scenario where you do not want to commingle, right, the data. Maybe you have a bunch of contracts. Maybe you just have different populations that you don't want to commingle their data. Doing federated learning and then aggregation of those things, especially around your language modeling, I could see being really useful.
So we had this question in the panel, and I'm curious because the panel members weren't doing too much on this just yet, and I wonder if UHC is. Are you doing A/B split testing on your conversations in your assistants?
It's a great question. As far as I am aware, that is something that we are not yet actively doing, but kind of at the point where we want to now. So from a crawl, walk, run perspective, you need effective chatbots before you can then go measure their efficacy and think about how to improve them, right? And I think that is definitely an area that we are now ready to start tackling.
Awesome. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you use conversation data to improve?
Sure. So I think one of the unique things about our domain, right, is that we're not kind of a generic lexicon. So if you're calling in to talk to us about your prescription, general business, ASR, entity recognition, any of the kind of natural language tools you'd use don't necessarily work well. Even if you're talking about benefits, plans, and it's kind of the lingo around insurance, those are not common. You're not going to get them from a lot of the open source data sets. So we have to invest heavily in making sure that our language models represent the domains in which we're deploying these things. So that's one obvious place where we use the conversational data that we have to make sure that our language models are actually representing the conversations that are taking place. Because some of these topics are very complex, we're able to also kind of identify the types of questions people have and the types of things about which they are potentially calling in because they're confused, they don't understand, whether or not something is covered. And one of the opportunities when you have that sort of information is not just to improve your chatbots, right? It's to improve your call center agents' training. Because maybe you say, a bunch of people are asking about this newly emergent thing, this COVID thing. Have we trained our call center agents on this? Have we updated the content on our digital properties, our websites, our mobile apps? So it's a really kind of good way to get that feedback about the sorts of things that your customers are confused about, or maybe don't have enough information about, and then push that out across all of your channels.
So you've started to answer this, but how important is collecting and annotating data as opposed to other machine learning tasks like hyperparameter tuning?
So it's incredibly important, especially at the I would say the language modeling stage. Now, you're not necessarily always labeling things, especially when you're building kind of pre-trained language models, right? But from an entity extraction perspective, these types of things, absolutely, right? If you were to just imagine a simple chatbot scenario where you want to say, you maybe refilling prescriptions, something like that. You absolutely need to understand which is the prescription and what is the drug name, and those sorts of things just require labeling, right? They require data. We're in a good position in that we get to have those conversations with our members and have, right, for years. But it's always work to then take data and make it usable.
I have a great question from Tiffany. How did your original set of intents evolve to?
Great question. So when you think about the three Venn diagrams I talked about, right? Value, viability, are customers ready? There's that can give you kind of your seed, right? And I think like any project I've ever done in these spaces, whether it was at UHG or elsewhere, you have some initial ideas, right, around what your intents are going to be. Then I think this is where two things that come into play. One of them is, are you using that feedback loop to identify those off the happy path intents? And then two, how many of those can you actually fulfill? So there is, like, if you think about all of the different scenarios via which you might want to interact with the UnitedHealth Group, we need to be able to actually service those things, whether it's a scheduling call, a prescription refill, explain to me my benefits, tell me where to go, which doctor should I meet. If we don't actually have APIs that can answer those questions, because maybe those were done manually, maybe that information was put on a website that a call center agent would read back to you, there is a little bit of making a chicken and egg problem to make sure that that your chatbot can consume that information. And this goes back to structuring your information in a way that, that is amenable to kind of feeding back into chatbots. So there is both what were we missing? And that's kind of a retrospective data look as data comes in. And then what could we actually do next? And I think the combination of those two things drives it.
Sorry about that. My mute was not engaging. I think I had a little internet glitch. Okay, so here's why I ended my panel, and I want to ask you the same question because it gets some really cool answers. So what achievement in the last maybe year, 9 months are you most proud of with your conversational AI team at UnitedHealth?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that we have done an incredible amount of work of unlocking the value in a lot of clinical documents so if you, talk about healthcare, a lot of data comes to you via fax or via clinical notes that are written. That's just the state of the industry, right? So when you want to make that data available and improve members' outcomes and kind of answer questions that people have, you've got to unlock that. And so our investments in kind of language modeling, understanding how to unlock that information have really set us up to create, I think, a bunch of pretty magical scenarios for us moving forward. This is foundational work because there's nobody has that sort of data at the scale that we do and the incentives to really say we understand how to reason over language that is about insurance, that is about in the clinical space, et cetera. And so we've done a lot of great work in that space. And I think that that's only going to make things like chatbots more effective for us as we move forward.
Awesome. So that really takes us to the end of our talk. Thank you so much, Josh. This was amazing. Josh, can our audience members find you on Twitter, LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn is a great spot to find me. If you find me on Twitter, I'm probably mostly just making snarky comments about basketball. So
Got it. So basketball fans do look for him, and conversational AI fans find him on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Josh, thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah.